Hey everyone, today we're looking at a Roland JV-80 synthesizer. This synth has got some button issues. The buttons on them and on a lot of the sound presets and other functions on it are not working. So we're going to be opening it up and taking a look and seeing what's involved in replacing the switches. This is a common problem on these older synths. This JV-80 specifically came out in 1991, so it's getting up there in age, almost a little over 25 years now at this point. I've owned this specific synthesizer for about 15 years, maybe 16 years. It's been some time. The buttons have always been a little bit finicky, even when I bought it initially secondhand, but they've definitely gotten worse over time. I haven't used it that much and been kind of sitting dormant for a little bit here, but I recently took it out and started using it again, and that's when I realized I've got to take care of these buttons. The JV series synth from Roland was a very, very popular, and is still a very popular line of synthesizers. The JV-80, JV-90 are two of the bigger units in the series. The 80 that I have here is the 61 key version. The JV-90 is the 76 key version. There was also a JV-30, a JV-35, then all the famous rack units as well, the JV-1080, the JV-2080. All of these are expandable with the Roland JV series of expansion cards. They're basically PCM encoded ROM cards with various genres of sound that you can upgrade these units with, which makes them very popular. Having known this for 15 some years, I've actually never opened it, so I'm kind of curious to take a look around inside. So while we'll have it open, we'll kind of take a look at the chipset and see what's in there and what makes this thing run. So here's a close-up of part of the data entry keypad on this synthesizer. The issue I'm having, like I said, is some of the buttons just don't select correctly. So you can hear a physical click making contact of the switch, but you have to press it relatively hard to actually get it to go. Some of these will not move at all, and you have to put a significant amount of force on them, which I don't want to push too hard. I don't want to actually damage possibly the board underneath that it's mounted to, but it makes the synth kind of hard to use. So it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. Even though some switches are still working, I'm most likely going to replace every single one on this synth. I haven't counted them on there. There's probably 40 if I had to guess. I'll take a closer look here and actually count them, but other people have reported this problem too, so I know it's common. It's nothing unusual, and 25 years old, it's disappointing but not unexpected. Something I've always loved with this specific synth is this beautiful inverted display. A lot of the LCDs on these older synthesizers were always just your typical backlit green display that, whatever. The inverted ones always just look so nice. It's also the reason why on my QS8 that I recently went through and restored, I replaced the LCD that was dead on it anyway with an inverted one as well. They just look so much nicer. One annoying feature of a lot of the older Roland synths, I don't know if they still do this today, but they always had this 2-pin power cable, which was really annoying because it's very similar to your standard IEC style power cable, but the IEC cable won't fit. So when you lose this or you misplace this, you are kind of out of luck. One thing I've done in the past is actually cut apart an IEC standard power cord into something like this, which if you cut enough of the plastic away, it will fit in there. This isn't recommended, but when you're in a bind, this is an option to at least get the thing powered up. What most people do is actually replace the jack on the back with a standard IEC plug, basically a connector on there, so you can use any standard computer cord in there. And the actual hole in the unit that they have is standard with most of the plugs you find on your computers and stuff like that. So swapping it out is a pretty trivial task. I have the synth upside down on my bench. I threw a towel down just so I don't scratch any of the cover of the buttons on the top of this. I noticed a couple dents in here too, which I actually never noticed before, because I've never opened this, looked at the bottom of it. I don't think I did that, but it was probably like that when I bought it. So handful of screws around the perimeter and it should open right up. So I was wrong about the screws. You actually had to take every single one off the bottom here to get it out. I figured the outside ones were there and maybe the keyboard itself was held to this bottom plate, but that wasn't the case. So with everything removed, that comes off rather neatly. See on the bottom side here, there's quite a bit of dust and dirt that falls through the keys, so I'll clean all that out before it goes back together. I'll fix that dent too. While we're in here, we'll take a quick look around and see what components are inside this thing. So starting on what we're looking at is the right side of the synth right here is the power input side, and there's our power supply. Typical transformer, you can see it's actually got taps for 240 volts, so if you needed to convert this to a different country voltage, it's got all the taps on there from 240 down to 100 in Japan. So this would be an really easy conversion based on the taps in that transformer. Supply itself is multiple voltages here. We got plus and minus 12 volts off of a 7812 and 7912 regulator right here, just linear regulators. That's being fed to these pins here for the analog circuitry, most likely the digital analog converter as well. Then we've got a 5 volt regulator over here, and these are all labeled plus 5 digital on the output. So this is actually what's running all of our logic to the main board, which I'll show here in a second. Based on the age, everything on this is probably 5 volt. There might be some 3.3 volt stuff, but unlikely. If there was, there'd be onboard regulators in the main board to regulate that lower voltage. One thing I am noticing here is that the boards I need to get to with all the switches are basically underneath everything. So I'm going to have to completely tear this thing apart to get to all those buttons and all those switches, which is disappointing, but not really that big of a deal. It looks like it comes apart pretty easily. Over on the left side of the synth is our main board. So this is the only board in the synth, minus there's an analog output board that I'll show here in a second, and the control boards that basically have all the switches and controls on them. So this is it right here. First thing I notice is, much like the Alesis gear I've looked at, is that Roland apparently has all of their silicon custom made for them, because nearly every single chip on this board is badged Roland. The numbers themselves, the part numbers on the chips, I might be able to look up and find some information on them, but there's nothing on here in terms of any of even the ROM. It looks like these are the ROM down here. They're labeled Roland as well, so everything is Roland. Minus this guy, and that's our DAC. It's a Burr Brown PCM 69P. I'm familiar with that chip. I've seen it before. A lot of Roland gear uses it. It's a dual channel 18-bit DAC, pretty high quality. Based on the age, I mean, again, Burr Brown back in the day was expensive. That was a very, very expensive DACs, very high-end for that matter. You find them both in a lot of professional gear and a lot of high-end home gear. CD players at the time, things like this. They were pretty much the best DACs you could buy. This one was a lower-cost DAC. It's by no means they're high-end devices, but it was still very good, and it did its job for the day and even holds up quality-wise today. In this unit I do have a Roland expansion board. This is what I was talking about in terms of the Roland SR JV boards. So these work in pretty much every JV device out there. The rack units like the JV-1080 and 2080 can actually hold 4 of these instead of just one. The JV-80 was limited to a single module, which is I have right here. So I'm going to pull that out really quick and see what's underneath it. One thing I've ever pulled out. The card I have is the POP expansion card. It was just what was in it when I bought it. So all it contains is basically 4 more ROMs, all Roland branded, even though there's a Mitsubishi logo on there, so Mitsubishi must have been the manufacturer for these. But yeah, these are still available today. And the XP series of synth, which came after this JV series, so I think the XPs came out in like 94, 95. You had the XP10 as the low end, and there was the XP50, XP80. There was the XP rack modules. I think they were actually called XVs, and then there might have been an XV30 in there and a couple other variations of it as well. I don't remember exactly offhand, but so below that, a couple more Roland branded chips. One of those is probably the SRAM. I'm not sure which one, because there's our backup battery. I'll have to measure that. It's nice that Roland actually sockets this. A lot of manufacturers like Alesis actually soldered them in, which isn't that terrible of a thing, because the things will last 20-30 years depending on the battery that's in there in the draw, but it's still annoying to have to pull the board out just to replace the battery when the time comes to replace it, versus just having a socket in there where you can easily pull the board out, or pull the battery out, I meant. So you can see the split right here between the analog side of things and the digital side of things. This chip resides in both. It's got the digital inputs on this side and the analog outputs on this side. I followed these cables, and these are coming from the analog power supply outputs to power the analog voltages here. And then the outputs from here jump to the output board, which really isn't too much on it. It looks like mostly just some small op amps and things like this. So, but on here, a couple of the chips are JRC branded, Japan Radio Corp. So they're most likely op amps. I'll see if I can find any numbers on them. That is a 4565D 1008G. So looking at the date codes in these chips too, they're all mostly 92. So 12th week 92, 7th week 92. So manufacturing date of mine looks to be at least 92, 93, somewhere in that range. A lot of small electrolytic caps like you find in most analog audio output circuitry. All of them look fine though, nothing looks like it's leaking. These are all really small signal caps. I don't expect anything in this region of the board to run very hot, so I'm sure these are probably all 85C rated. The odds of them actually failing at this point are pretty unlikely, so they probably won't need any attention, which is a good thing. So there's quite a few of them on there. At least they're all leaded through caps. They could all be surface mount caps, electrolytics, which are really a pain to replace. Those are definitely not my friend. Here's the last little analog board that is tied to all the actual analog outputs. On here you have the left-right stereo outputs and then the headphone output as well. There's a bunch of little SIP modules, all labeled JRC, Japan Radio Corp. They are most likely little op amps just for actual audio output and possibly some filtering on there as well. So we get to the switchboards that I need to replace, which is this board here, this one here, which also has the LCD on it, and then another one underneath here. I'm going to have to remove everything. Power supply has to come out. The additional round card here has to come out. The main board has to come out. The audio output board has to come out. The entire key assembly has to come out. So I'm going to be stripping this entire thing down basically to get to those buttons. What a chore. Alright, the boards are out, so that was a nightmare. There was a lot of layers, a lot of cables, a lot of screws, a lot of buried screws. I took a bunch of pictures as I was pulling this apart because in a week or so when I order the parts and put this back together, I'm not going to remember. So we will do our best with that. It'll probably be one of those situations where there will be some screws left over, and that's just how it is. But it'll be fine. So the good news is that the switches are all pretty much exactly what I expected. Your typical little micro switches, I guess you'd call them. I don't know the exact name for them. I'll have to look them up. Just simple little contact switches that I mean, even when the buttons were in it, the plastic buttons to push down on these, they still made a tactile click. So the spring inside them is still working, it's just the contacts inside are worn. It's a really weird failure mode. I'll have to take one apart after I get them out of here to take a look at it, just because I'm really curious why they fail that way. It's such a simple little switch, you don't think that they would go wrong. I mean, Again, I don't know how much this was used before I bought it. I know in my use of it, it wasn't honestly that much. I'm curious what the manufacturer rating of the actual clicks until failure is on these switches in terms of their lifetime. It does seem to be the more commonly used switches in terms of, I remember it was a couple on the actual voice selection switches here, and then the first couple waveform selection switches as well, or PCM sample switches, I guess you'd say, the actual sounds, the sound selection switches. Other than that, taken apart inside, it was extremely clean. Everything was extremely well put together. All the cables were very nicely bundled and tied down. Nothing was moving around in there, so great construction. Every Roland piece of gear I've ever taken apart has just been really, really, really impressive in terms of the actual build quality of it. I mean, this gear wasn't cheap either when it came out. I don't know what the MSRP was when it was released in the early 90s, but I'm sure it was not an inexpensive synth. Alright, let's see if we can locate these switches. Alright, so I pulled one of the switches off. It's a 2-pin switch, which I didn't realize. Most of the ones I've seen like this in the past are 4-pin. So I'm going to have to locate a 2-pin switch this size that has measurements of roughly a little over 6 millimeters square and a height of about 3.5 millimeter. So for this, typically, how many of you still have a printed Digikey catalog? I do. I like the printed catalog because when you're just looking for something like a switch or a connector, it is so much easier just to quickly find it based on having all the pictures in front of you to be able to find one time. Yes, as far as I know, they don't make these anymore. They stopped making about 10 years ago. This one's dated 2006. This was the last one, at least I remember receiving. But again, for switches and connectors, especially plugs, when you're trying to find odd ones, trying to do the parametric search online is just, I find it just difficult. If I'm looking for passives or semiconductors, things like that, it's fine, but be able to compare the picture to what I'm looking at, especially for something like a switch like this, just makes things so much easier. So I'll go through Digikey, I'll find the actual switch I need. I mean, prices for these are unbelievably cheap. You know, in quantities of 100, they're 19 cents. In quantities of 10, 22 cents. So they're not expensive. So I'm going to buy them all just for the entire unit. I'll get whatever price break makes sense, and then replace every single one on this board and be done. Alright, after much searching, I realized the key measurement is this, which is the overall switch height. In this case, right around 5 millimeters. So the winner, based on Digikey current stock for me, is a Panasonic switch, a 5N Type 2R light touch switch of the EVQ2 series. In this case, Digikey part number P12225SCT-ND. In quantities of 50, it is $9.90. So I will get those ordered. So in total count, there are 60 little micro switches across this, or tactile switches across these two boards I need to replace. I ended up ordering 64 from Digikey, just so I had a few spares in case I happen to break one or something, some other reason I needed to replace. I ended up taping some fine tissue across the display, just so that when I'm working on this, I don't end up scratching the display, because I'll be flipping this back and forth a couple of times. Now, to actually desolder these, I'm going to be using solder wick. I find solder wick is the best option for these. I have a vacuum desoldering station, but the way that these pins are on this board, the pins are folded over. And the desoldering station works best for items like ICs where the pins are in a straight vertical orientation, so you can get the desoldering vacuum portion tip on each pin and be able to suck the solder out. For the pins that are laid like this, it doesn't work as well, and I find just using regular solder wick actually ends up working best. This will probably take me half hour or so to remove all these, but it won't be too bad. Soldering the new ones in will go really quick, which will be good. It ended up being a nice discovery that these are only 2-pin switches versus 4-pin. It would have taken me twice as long to do all the actual 4-pin switches versus these. Alright, all the switches are removed. I've got a whole file of old bad switches here now. Actually, it took about 10-15 minutes. It went pretty quick. Just the ease of a single layer board. It's so much easier to desolder than your typical double layer or quad layer grater, which can be a lot more difficult. No big ground planes either, so all the solder came out relatively easily on the back. Wasn't very much of anything, so time for new switches. I did want to take one of these apart and just see if I can see what the actual problem inside it is. I'm just curious what its actual failure mode is. There we go. Alright, so just a small metal ring holds in the actual plastic push button, which has a center little plastic pin that pushes down on a metal disc. To a small set of contacts in there. So there is some, I don't even know what it is on the metal disc there. I mean, it still looks conductive. Little pads inside the switch itself. Unless they just get worn to a point where the disc doesn't come in contact anymore, but there's nothing obvious. It's been a couple days, but I did receive all of my new tactile switches from Digikey. Taking a look at these and comparing them to the original switch, they look pretty much spot on. Get the focus. So I think we're good. Next step is to stick these in to every spot in the synth, solder them in, and then basically reassemble. So I will get started on that now. Okay, all the switches are in. Next I need to clean up a little bit, then I'm going to start reassembly. I'm probably not going to film the reassembly. It's going to be the same as the teardown, just reverse. I'm going to have to reference some pictures I took as well, just to make sure I get everything back in the correct order. Alright, I have it all back together. There was only 2 screws remaining that I can't figure out where they went. I looked at all the pictures I took. I even looked back at some of the video I took. I looked everywhere on the synth. I can't figure out. I'm curious if maybe they were just on my bench and they got mixed in with my other screws, but I'm not sure. Putting the cover back on now, I fixed the dent a little bit that was on the side here. So I'm just going to throw a couple screws on it to hold it together so I can test it out before I put all the screws back in. But everything looks good so far. Time for the moment of truth. Got it all back together. Power up. Power's on. That's a good sign. The question is, do all the buttons work? Those are feeling great. Those, the 1 and 4 were the ones that had the biggest problems before. So, along with 9 here on the sound bank, everything is looking good, which is awesome. Tone selects all work. Here. Everything's working. So I'm super thrilled with that. Functionality has been restored. It was a pain to do. Cost-wise, it was cheap. With shipping, it was only about $16 for all the switches from Digikey, which was nice. So that is how you replace the tactile switches on a Roland JV-80. And with this too, most Roland synthesizers use those same switches. So I know the XP series, I believe, uses the same switches. The JP8000 I think uses the same switches. A lot of the MC303, MC505, a lot of the groove boxes Roland makes uses the same switches. It's all on the era that they built these at. I don't have anything modern enough to look inside, but I'd imagine even the same stuff today probably still uses these switches. So even though this specific fix was for my Roland JV-80, it probably applies to most of the other Roland synthesizers out there. So hopefully you found this useful, and thanks for watching.